The gate had been broken for as long as Dahlia Harrison could remember, its warped wooden slats hanging from rusted hinges like a mouth frozen mid-scream. She stood beside it now, her cotton dress billowing in the relentless Wyoming wind, watching the horizon where the setting sun painted the empty plains in hues of amber and gold. 3 years a widow before she'd ever been a proper wife, abandoned at the altar by a groom who died in a saloon brawl the night before their wedding. Now, at 22, she was neither maiden nor widow, but something in between, an outcast bride with no husband to claim her. April 1876 was proving to be as cruel as the winter that had preceded it. The small homestead she'd inherited from her father was barely holding together, much like the gate that marked its entrance. Most days, Dahlia convinced herself she preferred the solitude, the independence. But on evenings like this, with the coyotes beginning their mournful songs in the distance, loneliness cut deeper than the spring chill. Another day gone. She murmured to no one, her fingers tracing the splintered wood of the gate post. The small ranch had once been her father's pride, before consumption took him 2 winters past. Now it was her burdened 5 acres, a modest cabin, 2 milk cows, and a small vegetable garden that was more stubborn than productive. Dahlia had just turned to head back to the cabin when she saw a plume of dust on the horizon, moving steadily toward her property. Visitors were rare this far from town, and rarely brought good news. Her hand instinctively moved to the pocket of her apron where she kept her father's small derringer. As the rider drew closer, the dying sunlight revealed a tall figure atop a chestnut stallion. The stranger rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His broad shoulders were wrapped in a dust-covered duster, and a well-worn Stetson cast shadows across his face. He pulled his horse to a stop several yards from where she stood, and for a moment, they simply regarded one another through the broken gate, him still mounted, her with her hand still hovering near her hidden weapon. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and rough with trailed dust. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. "Name's Knox Blackwood. I don't mean to intrude, but my horse could use water, and I've been riding since dawn." Dahlia studied him carefully. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, even in the fading light, were startlingly blue against his tanned skin. "Water's around back," she replied cautiously. "You can use the trough, but I'd appreciate if you'd state your business after." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he dismounted with fluid grace. "Much obliged." He led his horse through the broken gate, the wood creaking in protest as he pushed it wider. "As for my business, I'm just passing through. Heading to Laramie." "You're a good ways off the main trail," Dahlia observed, keeping her distance as she led him toward the water trough behind the cabin. "Got some trouble following me," he admitted, watching as his horse drank eagerly. "Thought it best to take the less traveled routes." "What kind of trouble?" Dahlia's fingers tightened around the derringer in her pocket. Knox met her gaze directly. "Nothing I'd bring to your doorstep intentionally, madam. I can water my horse and be on my way if you'd prefer." There was something in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, that made Dahlia hesitate. The sensible thing would be to send him on his way. But the sun was nearly gone now, and the night would be cold. "You can stay in the barn for the night," she found herself saying. "But I'll be locking my door, and I sleep with a shotgun beside my bed." Knox nodded, a genuine smile breaking through his tired expression. "I wouldn't expect anything less from a woman managing on her own out here." He extended his hand. "I don't believe I caught your name, Mississippi." "Mrs. Harrison," she corrected automatically, though it wasn't entirely true. "Dahlia Harrison." She didn't take his hand, and after a moment he lowered it without comment. "There's a pump by the barn," she continued, "and some oats for your horse. I'll bring you some supper once I've tended to my evening chores." "I don't want to put you out, it's no trouble," Dahlia interrupted. "It's not often I have company, Mr. Blackwood." "Knox," he said. "Just Knox is fine." Dahlia nodded stiffly and turned toward the cabin. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked away, and something fluttered in her stomach, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Inside the cabin, Dahlia moved about her small kitchen, adding another potato to the stew she'd started earlier. Her hands worked automatically while her mind raced. It had been nearly 6 months since she'd spoken more than a few words to anyone besides the shopkeeper in town. Having a stranger on her property, a handsome stranger with trouble on his heels, was unsettling. Through the window, she watched as Knox tended to his horse in the barn, his movements efficient and gentle with the animal. He'd removed his duster, revealing broad shoulders and a lean waist. A gunbelt hung low on his hips, not unusual for a man traveling alone, but it reminded her that she knew nothing about this man beyond his name. When she carried a bowl of stew and a chunk of cornbread out to the barn, she found him spreading fresh hay in an empty stall. "You didn't need to do that," she said, setting the food on a barrel near the door. Knox straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Seemed the least I could do for your hospitality." He nodded toward the food. "That's mighty kind of you." "It's just stew," Dahlia said, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing fancy. After a week of jerky and hardtack, it looks like a feast." He approached slowly, as if careful not to startle her. In the lantern light, she could see his features more clearly: the straight nose, the faint scar that ran along his jawline, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his current demeanor indicated. "Where are you coming from?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her caution. Knox picked up the bowl, inhaling the steam appreciatively before answering. "Colorado. Worked as a ranch foreman there for a spell. And now?" He took a spoonful of stew, closing his eyes briefly as he savored it. "Now I'm looking for something new." When he opened his eyes again, they held a wariness that matched her own. "Life has a way of pushing a man in new directions when he least expects it." Dahlia understood that sentiment all too well. "Well, I won't keep you from your supper. Good night, Mr. Blackwood." "Knox," he reminded her. "And thank you again, Mrs. Harrison." "Dahlia," she found herself saying, surprising even herself. "If we're to be on a first-name basis." His smile was warm, genuine. "Good night then, Dahlia." Back in her cabin, Dahlia prepared for bed with more care than usual, washing her face and brushing out her long chestnut hair before braiding it loosely for sleep. She told herself it was merely routine, but she couldn't deny the heightened awareness that came with having a man nearby, even if he was sleeping in the barn. As promised, she locked her door and propped her father's shotgun beside her bed. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was not fear that followed her into her dreams, but the memory of Knox's smile and the way he'd said her name. Morning came with the insistent crowing of her rooster. Dahlia dressed quickly in a simple blue work dress and made her way to the kitchen. Through the window, she could see Knox already up and moving about the barnyard, carrying water to her vegetable garden. She frowned. She hadn't asked for his help, and there was something unsettling about watching a stranger attend to her chores as if he belonged there. She quickly mixed biscuit dough and set it aside to rise while she fried bacon and eggs. By the time Knox knocked on her door, she had a hearty breakfast laid out on her small table. "Morning," he said when she opened the door. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd washed at the pump, and he trimmed his stubble to a neater shadow along his jaw. "I hope you don't mind, but I saw your garden look thirsty." "I would have gotten to it," Dahlia said more defensively than she'd intended. "I don't doubt it," he replied easily. "Consider it payment for the hospitality." She stepped back, allowing him to enter. "I've made breakfast. You should eat before you head out." Knox removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "That's very generous of you." "It's practical," Dahlia said, turning to the stove to hide the flush she could feel rising in her cheeks. "A hungry traveler is a careless one." "I'd rather you be alert when you leave here, especially if you have trouble following you." He laughed softly. "Fair enough." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of cutlery against plates and the occasional whinny from the horses outside. Dahlia found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. In the morning light, she could see that his eyes weren't just blue but had flecks of gray in them, like storm clouds gathering over the prairie. You mentioned you're a widow, Knox said eventually, breaking the silence. Recently? Dahlia set down her fork. Not exactly. She rarely spoke about Patrick to anyone, but something about Knox's direct gaze made her continue. My fiancée died the night before our wedding. 3 years ago now. Some folks in town still call me Mrs. Harrison, though I never technically earned the title. Knox's expression softened with understanding. That's a heavy burden to carry. I manage, she said simply. What about you? You have family waiting in Laramie? A shadow passed over his face. No family to speak of. Not anymore. Before she could inquire further, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Dahlia rose quickly and moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain. 3 riders were approaching from the east, moving with purpose toward her broken gate. Friends of yours? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Knox was on his feet immediately, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. The trouble I mentioned. He moved to stand beside her, peering out the window. I should go. I don't want to bring this to your doorstep. It's already here, Dahlia pointed out, reaching for her shotgun. And I don't take kindly to uninvited guests. Knox looked at her with newfound respect and concern. These men are dangerous, Dahlia. So am I when threatened, she replied, checking that the shotgun was loaded. Who are they, and what do they want with you? Knox's jaw tightened. Bounty hunters. They think I killed a man in Denver. I didn't, but they're not interested in the truth, just the reward. The riders had reached the gate now. One of them, a burly man with a red beard, dismounted and pushed through the broken entrance. The other 2 remained mounted, scanning the property with practiced eyes. You have 2 choices, Dahlia said, her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest. Run out the back and leave me to deal with them, or stand with me and tell me the truth. Knox met her gaze, his expression grave. I'll stand with you. Together they stepped onto the porch just as the red-bearded man reached the bottom step. He stopped short at the sight of Knox, his hand hovering near his holstered pistol. Blackwood, he growled. Should have known we'd find you hiding behind a woman's skirts. Dahlia leveled the shotgun at the man's chest. You're trespassing on private property, mister. State your business or turn around. The man sneered, looking her up and down with undisguised contempt. This ain't your concern, lady. We've got business with Blackwood here. Any business with my husband is my concern, Dahlia said, the lie falling from her lips before she had time to consider it. She felt Knox stiffen beside her, but he didn't contradict her. The bounty hunter laughed, a harsh sound that set Dahlia's teeth on edge. Your husband? That's rich. Blackwood ain't the marrying kind, especially not to some dried-up spinster playing at being a rancher. Knox took a step forward, his voice dangerously low. You'll apologize to my wife, Reeves, or I'll give you a matching scar on the other side of that ugly face of yours. The man named Reeves touched a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, his expression darkening. You got lucky last time, Blackwood. This time I brought friends. He nodded toward the mounted men. I'm not looking for trouble, Knox said. I told you in Denver I didn't kill Whitaker. He was dead when I found him. Tell it to the judge, Reeves spat. There's $500 on your head, and I aim to collect. Dahlia kept the shotgun steady. I don't know what happened in Denver, but my husband's been here with me for the past month. Whatever you're accusing him of, you've got the wrong man. Knox gave her a quick, grateful glance before turning his attention back to the bounty hunters. You heard the lady. Now I suggest you leave before this gets ugly. Reeves hesitated, his eyes darting between Knox and Dahlia. She could see the calculation in his face weighing the risk of a shotgun blast against the reward money. This ain't over, Blackwood, he finally said, backing toward his horse. You can't hide behind your wife forever. We'll be watching, and the moment you step foot off this property, we'll be there. Then I suggest you pack a lunch, Knox replied evenly. Because I'm not going anywhere. The three men retreated, casting dark looks over their shoulders as they rode back through the broken gate. Dahlia kept the shotgun raised until they disappeared over the ridge. When they were gone, she lowered the weapon and turned to Knox, her heart still racing. You have some explaining to do, Mr. Blackwood. Knox ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I owe you that much, at least. Though I'm curious why you told them I was your husband. Dahlia felt heat rise in her cheeks. It seemed prudent. A woman alone might not be taken seriously, but a wife defending her husband might give them pause. Knox finished with a nod. Quick thinking. They returned to the cabin, where Knox sank into a chair at the table, his expression troubled. Dahlia set the shotgun aside but remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest. I was working as a ranch foreman outside Denver, Knox began. The owner, Whitaker, was a hard man but fair. 2 weeks ago, I found him dead in his office, shot in the back. His safe was open, empty. I was checking for a pulse when his wife walked in. He shook his head grimly. It looked bad. She screamed, accused me of killing him for the money. By the time the sheriff arrived, half the town was convinced I was guilty. Were you? Dahlia asked bluntly. Knox met her gaze, his eyes clear and unwavering. No. But the sheriff was Whitaker's brother-in-law, and he wasn't interested in evidence that suggested otherwise. So you ran. I left. Knox corrected. There's a difference. I'm not running from justice. I'm avoiding a lynching. I plan to head to Laramie, find work under a different name until things cooled down enough for the truth to come out. Dahlia considered this. She'd heard stories of men falsely accused, of justice perverted by personal vendettas and hasty judgments. Her own father had taught her to look for the truth beneath the surface of things. Those men will be back, she said finally. Or they'll wait you out. Either way, you're effectively trapped here. Knox nodded grimly. I'm sorry to have brought this trouble to your door. I'll understand if you want me to leave. Dahlia surprised herself with her next words. If you're telling the truth, then leaving would be foolish. They'd catch you before you reached the county line. She paused, weighing her options. If you stay, you'll need a better story than showing up out of nowhere as my husband. What did you have in mind? The truth, or a version of it, Dahlia said, thinking quickly. You're an old friend of my father's, come to help with the spring planting. It would explain your presence here and give you a reason to stay until we figure out how to clear your name. Knox studied her, his expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Why would you help me? You barely know me. Dahlia moved to the window, gazing out at her small, struggling ranch. The garden Knox had watered earlier glinted in the morning sun, the soil dark and rich with moisture. Beyond it, the broken gate stood as a reminder of all the things she hadn't been able to fix on her own. Because I know what it's like to be judged unfairly, she said softly. After Patrick died, people looked at me differently. Some pitied me, others whispered that I was cursed or that I'd somehow caused his death. Eventually, I stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. She turned back to face him. I know what it's like to be an outcast. And I don't think you killed that man. Knox stood slowly, approaching her with careful steps. If I stay, I can help around the place. That garden needs more than water, it needs proper fencing to keep the rabbits out. And that gate should be replaced before it falls down completely. I don't need charity, Dahlia said sharply. It's not charity, Knox replied. It's an exchange. You're providing me shelter and an alibi. I'm offering my labor in return. Seems fair to me. Dahlia considered this. Her pride bristled at accepting help, but practicality won out. She'd been struggling to maintain the ranch alone, and with spring planting season upon her, an extra pair of hands would make a significant difference. All right, she agreed finally. But we need to establish some ground rules. This is still my home, and I expect you to respect that. Of course, Knox said solemnly. Your house, your rules. You'll continue to sleep in the barn, Dahlia continued. And if anyone from town comes by, you'll stick to our story about being my father's friend. Knox nodded. Anything else? Dahlia hesitated, then added firmly. This arrangement is temporary. Once we figure out how to clear your name, or once the bounty hunters give up, you'll move on to Laramie as planned. Something flickered in Knox's eyes, disappointment, perhaps, but he nodded again. Agreed. They shook hands to seal the arrangement, and Dahlia tried to ignore the warmth that spread through her at his touch. She had been alone for so long that even this simple contact felt significant, dangerous in its potential to awaken feelings she'd carefully buried after Patrick's death. As Knox released her hand and turned to gather his hat, Dahlia reminded herself that this was a practical arrangement, nothing more. Knox Blackwood was a man in trouble, and she was simply offering the kind of help she would wish for if their situations were reversed. But as she watched him stride toward the barn, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning sun, she couldn't help but wonder if she just made the wisest decision or the most foolish one of her life. The following days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Knox rose before dawn each morning to tend to the livestock before Dahlia was even awake. By the time she emerged from the cabin, he would have the coffee brewing and would be working on whatever project he'd set for himself that day. On the third morning, Dahlia found him examining the broken gate, measuring the posts with a length of twine. I found some lumber in the shed that might work for this, he said when he noticed her watching. If you don't mind me using it. My father was saving it for repairs, Dahlia replied, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. He never got around to most of them. Knox nodded sympathetically. Consumption, you said? It took him quickly, at least. Small mercies. Dahlia rarely spoke of her father's death, but with Knox, the words came easier than expected. He taught me everything I know about running this place, but there are some tasks I haven't mastered yet. Like gate repair? Knox asked with a small smile. Like gate repair, she agreed, returning his smile hesitantly. Though I did manage to replace the roof shingles last fall all by myself. Knox looked impressed. That's no small feat. Most men I know would struggle with that job alone. His easy acknowledgement of her capabilities warmed Dahlia more than she cared to admit. In town, the men either pitted her attempts at self-sufficiency or dismissed them entirely, assuming she would eventually sell the ranch or remarry out of necessity. I'll make breakfast, she said, turning back toward the cabin. You can tell me what else you plan to tackle today while we eat. Over plates of flapjacks and bacon, Knox outlined his ideas for improving the ranch, fixing the chicken coop, reinforcing the barn's north wall, and building proper fencing for the vegetable garden. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Dahlia found herself adding to his list, mentioning repairs she'd been putting off for months. The well pump sticks sometimes, she said, pouring more coffee into his cup. Especially after a heavy rain. I'll take a look at it, Knox promised. Might just need some grease and a new leather gasket. As they cleared the breakfast dishes together, Dahlia was struck by how comfortable their interaction had become in such a short time. There was an ease between them that she hadn't experienced with anyone since her father died. I need to go into town today, she said as she dried the last plate. We're running low on flour and coffee, and I should check if there's any mail. Knox's expression grew serious. Those bounty hunters could be watching the road. They're looking for you, not me, Dahlia pointed out. Besides, I can't avoid town forever. People will talk if I change my routines too dramatically. People talk regardless, Knox said with a wry smile. But you're right. Just be careful. Don't mention me unless you have to, and stick to our story if you do. Dahlia nodded, touched by his concern. I know how to keep secrets, Knox. I've had plenty of practice. She hitched her mare to the small wagon and set off for town, her thoughts lingering on Knox as the ranch receded behind her. In just 3 days he had already made noticeable improvements to her property, working from sunrise to sunset with tireless energy. More than that, he had brought a presence to her solitary life, someone to talk with over meals, someone whose opinions and ideas sparked her own. It was dangerous, she knew, to become accustomed to having him around. He would leave eventually, once his name was cleared or the bounty hunters gave up their pursuit. The ranch would fall silent again, and she would return to her solitary existence. The thought brought an unexpected ache to her chest. The small town of Willow Creek came into view, a collection of wooden buildings lining a dusty main street. Dahlia steered her wagon toward the general store, nodding politely to the few townspeople she passed along the way. Most returned her greeting with the same cautious politeness, though a few women huddled together, whispering as she passed. Inside the store, Mr. Peterson greeted her with his usual friendly nod. "Mrs. Harrison, good to see you. Been a while since you've come to town." "Spring keeps me busy at the ranch," Dahlia replied, handing him her list of supplies. "How's Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism?" "Better, now that the weather's warming." He began gathering her items, moving with deliberate slowness that suggested he was in the mood for conversation. "Heard there was some excitement out your way yesterday. Strangers asking directions to your place." Dahlia kept her expression neutral. "Is that so?" "3 rough-looking fellows," Peterson continued, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Said they were looking for an old friend who might be staying with you." "No friends visiting me," Dahlia said carefully. "Just me and the livestock, same as always." Peterson studied her for a moment, his bushy eyebrows drawn together. "That's what I told them, but they seemed mighty interested all the same. Said they'd check anyway." "Well, they did," Dahlia admitted, deciding a partial truth was safer than an outright lie. "Showed up uninvited and left disappointed. I don't appreciate strangers trespassing on my property." "Can't blame you there," Peterson agreed, adding a scoop of hard candies to her order without being asked, his usual kindness to her since her father's death. "Times being what they are, a woman alone can't be too careful." The bell above the door jingled, and Dahlia turned to see Sheriff Miller entering the store. The sheriff was a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache and perpetually tired eyes. He nodded to Peterson before turning his attention to Dahlia. "Mrs. Harrison," he greeted, removing his hat. "Just the person I was hoping to see." Dahlia's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Sheriff Miller. What can I do for you?" "Got a wire from Denver yesterday," he said, producing a folded paper from his vest pocket. "They're looking for a fugitive who might have passed through these parts. Man named Knox Blackwood, wanted for murder and theft." Dahlia forced herself to look mildly interested rather than alarmed. "I haven't encountered any fugitives, Sheriff. Those men who visited you yesterday seem to think otherwise," Miller said, watching her reaction closely. "They stopped by my office afterward, showed me the wanted poster. Those men trespassed on my property and were told to leave," Dahlia replied firmly. "If they're bounty hunters, they're barking up the wrong tree. I haven't seen anyone matching that description." The sheriff studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Well, if you do, I'd appreciate you letting me know right away. This Blackwood character sounds dangerous, killed his employer in cold blood, according to the wire." "I'll keep that in mind," Dahlia said, turning back to Peterson to complete her transaction. She could feel the sheriff's eyes on her back as she counted out coins for her purchases. "By the way," Miller added as she gathered her parcels, "one of the Hanson boys mentioned seeing smoke from your chimney awful early these past few mornings. Said it was unusual, since you typically sleep later." Dahlia met his gaze evenly. "Spring planting means early starts, Sheriff. And I wasn't aware the Hanson boys made a habit of spying on my comings and goings." Miller had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Just neighborly concern, Mrs. Harrison. Nothing more." "Then please thank them for their concern," Dahlia said with forced politeness, "but assure them I'm managing just fine on my own." She left the store with her purchases, feeling the weight of both men's gazes following her out. As she loaded her supplies into the wagon, she noticed several townspeople watching her with newfound curiosity. News traveled fast in Willow Creek, and the bounty hunter's inquiries had clearly sparked interest in her normally unremarkable existence. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, each turn in the road bringing fresh worries. If the sheriff was already suspicious, it wouldn't take much to convince him to ride out and search her property. Knox's presence would be difficult to explain away, especially with a wanted poster detailing his description. When she finally approached the broken gate, now partially repaired with fresh lumber, Dahlia felt a wave of relief at the sight of Knox working in the garden. He straightened when he heard the wagon, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun to watch her approach. "Everything all right?" he asked as he helped her down from the wagon seat, his hands warm and strong at her waist. "Not exactly," Dahlia said, keeping her voice low even though there was no one else to hear. "The sheriff has a wire from Denver about you. And apparently the Hanson farm has a clear view of my chimney smoke." Knox's expression darkened. "We need to talk." They unloaded the supplies together, carrying them into the cabin where they could speak freely. Dahlia recounted her conversations in town while Knox listened intently, his jaw tightening at the mention of the wanted poster. "It's worse than I thought," he said when she finished. "If the sheriff's already suspicious, it won't be long before he rides out here to investigate." "What do we do?" Dahlia asked, surprising herself with the "we." Somehow, in just a few days, Knox's problems had become hers as well. Knox paced the small kitchen, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I could leave tonight, try to make it to the territorial border before they realize I'm gone." "And then what?" Dahlia challenged. "Keep running forever? That's no kind of life, Knox." He stopped pacing to look at her, his expression softening. "I know. But I can't put you at risk any longer. If they find me here, you could be charged with harboring a fugitive." "There has to be another way," Dahlia insisted. "You said you didn't kill Whitaker. There must be evidence, witnesses who could clear your name." Knox leaned against the kitchen counter, his shoulders slumping slightly. "The only person who might have seen something is Whitaker's foreman, Daniel Prescott. He was supposed to meet with Whitaker that afternoon, but claims he never made it to the office. I always thought that was strange, but I had no way to prove otherwise. Where is this Prescott now? Last I heard, he was promoted to ranch manager after Whitaker's death." "Convenient for him," Knox added bitterly. Dahlia thought for a moment. "Could you write to someone in Denver?" "Someone who might be willing to ask questions, look into Prescott's whereabouts that day?" "Maybe," Knox said slowly. "I have a friend who works at the livery stable in Denver. Owes me a favor or two. He might be willing to snoop around, see what he can learn about Prescott's movements that day." "It's a start," Dahlia said encouragingly. "In the meantime, we need to be more careful. No more early morning fires in the stove. We'll eat cold breakfasts if we have to. And you should stay out of sight during the day, work on projects that can't be seen from the road." Knox nodded, then surprised her by reaching out to take her hand. "Why are you doing this, Dahlia? You're risking everything to help a man you barely know." Dahlia looked down at their joined hands, feeling the rough calluses on his palm, the gentle strength in his fingers. She should pull away, maintain the careful distance she'd established between them, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. "I believe you," she said simply. "And I don't abandon people I believe in." Something shifted in Knox's gaze, a warmth, an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might pull her closer, and part of her a part she thought long dormant hoped he would. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Then we'll figure this out together," he promised. "And I'll do everything in my power to ensure you don't regret helping me." That evening, Knox wrote a letter to his friend in Denver, carefully outlining his suspicions about Prescott and asking for any information that might help clear his name. Dahlia added a few dollars from her meager savings to cover expenses the friend might incur while investigating. "I'll post this next time I'm in town," she said, sealing the envelope. "Though it might be best to wait a few days until the gossip dies down." Knox nodded, his expression troubled. I hate that I've made you a subject of town gossip. I was already that, Dahlia replied with a wry smile. The spinster widow who wasn't actually a widow, living alone on a failing ranch. I've been fodder for gossip since Patrick died. This ranch isn't failing, Knox said firmly. It's just been neglected. With proper care and a few improvements, it could be productive again. His confidence warmed her. My father used to say the same thing. He had such plans for this place, expanding the herd, planting an orchard on the south slope. Her smile faded. Then he got sick, and everything else became secondary. He'd be proud of how you've managed, Knox said softly. Not many women or men, for that matter, could have kept a ranch going alone for this long. Dahlia didn't know how to respond to his praise. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her struggles or her accomplishments. She busied herself with clearing away the writing materials, suddenly aware of how intimate the kitchen felt with just the two of them and the soft glow of the oil lamp between them. I should let you get some rest, she said finally. Tomorrow's another day. Knox stood, reaching for his hat. Indeed it is. And a busy one. I plan to finish that garden fence and see what can be done about reinforcing the north pasture. Don't overwork yourself on my account, Dahlia said. I've managed with things as they are for 2 years now. You've survived, Knox corrected gently. But you deserve more than just survival, Dahlia. With those words hanging in the air between them, he bid her good night and headed out to the barn, leaving Dahlia with a curious ache in her chest and the lingering warmth of his presence in her kitchen. That night, lying in her bed, Dahlia found sleep elusive. Knox's words echoed in her mind, you deserve more than just survival. She'd been so focused on simply maintaining what her father had built, on not losing ground, that she'd stopped thinking about what might lie beyond mere survival. Dreams, hopes, a future that involved more than just getting by, these were luxuries she'd set aside after Patrick's death and her father's illness. But now, with Knox bringing new energy and possibilities to the ranch, those long dormant feelings were beginning to stir again. It was dangerous, she knew, to build dreams around a man who would inevitably leave. Yet she couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to have a partner again, someone to share the burdens and joys of ranch life, someone to talk with at the end of long days. With such thoughts swirling in her mind, Dahlia finally drifted into a fitful sleep, dreaming of broken gates being made whole and empty places being filled. The next week passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Knox tackled project after project around the ranch, working with an intensity that suggested he was trying to outrun his own thoughts. He completed the garden fence, repaired the chicken coop, and replaced the broken gate with a sturdy new one that swung smoothly on well-oiled hinges. Dahlia, meanwhile, planted her vegetable garden and tended to the spring cleaning of the cabin. They fell into an easy routine, working separately during the day but coming together for meals, where their conversations grew increasingly comfortable and wide-ranging. Knox told her stories of his years working on various ranches across the territory, of cattle drives and frontier towns and the characters he'd met along the way. Dahlia shared memories of her father and their life before his illness, and even, hesitantly, a few stories about Patrick and the future they'd planned together. He was a dreamer, she said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Always talking about the grand house he'd build me once he struck it rich in the silver mines. Is that what he was doing when he died? Knox asked gently. Mining? Dahlia nodded, her fingers absently tracing the grain of the wooden chair arm. He'd been working a claim near Silver Creek for almost a year. Came to town that weekend for supplies and our wedding. Got into an argument with a card sharp at the Dusty Rose Saloon. She swallowed hard. They found him in the alley behind the saloon the next morning. Never even made it to our wedding day. Knox was quiet for a moment before saying, I'm sorry, Dahlia. That's a cruel hand fate dealt you. Life out here is cruel sometimes, she replied, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. You adapt or you break. And you didn't break, Knox observed. Dahlia turned to look at him, finding his eyes already on her, warm with admiration. Not yet, she said softly. Though there were days I came close. Knox reached across the space between their chairs, his hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both protective and reverent. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Dahlia Harrison. The air between them seemed to still, charged with unspoken possibilities. Dahlia knew she should pull her hand away, maintain the boundaries she'd established, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. Instead, she turned her palm upward, her fingers intertwining with his. For several heartbeats, they sat in silence, hands joined, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, the sound floating across the darkening prairie like a lonely question. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Knox was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip as he scanned the horizon. Someone's coming, he said, his voice low and urgent. 2 riders from the south. Dahlia stood, straining to see in the fading light. That's the direction of town. Get inside, Knox said, already moving toward the steps. I'll hide in the barn until we know who it is. No, Dahlia said firmly, placing a hand on his arm. If it's the sheriff, finding you hiding will only confirm his suspicions. We stick to our story. You're a friend of my father's, here to help with spring planting. Knox hesitated, clearly torn between protecting her and trusting her judgment. If it's those bounty hunters again, then we face them together, Dahlia said with more confidence than she felt. Go inside, put the coffee on. Act like we're expecting visitors. The riders were close enough now that Dahlia could make out their silhouettes against the darkening sky, one heavy set, the other tall and lean. Her heart sank as she recognized Sheriff Miller's distinctive shape. The other rider appeared to be young Dan Hansen, whose family owned the neighboring ranch. It's the sheriff, she murmured to Knox. And Dan Hansen probably brought him as a witness. Remember, you're James Knox, an old friend of my father's from his mining days. Knox nodded, squeezing her hand once before releasing it and heading inside. Dahlia remained on the porch, smoothing her skirts and taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. Sheriff Miller pulled his horse to a stop at the new gate, looking mildly surprised at the improvement. Evening, Mrs. Harrison, he called, removing his hat. Hope we're not intruding too late in the day. Not at all, Sheriff, Dahlia replied with forced pleasantness. I was just enjoying the evening air. What brings you out this way? Miller dismounted, leaving young Hansen awkwardly perched on his horse. Just making my rounds, checking on the outlying properties. Noticed some improvements as we rode up. New gate looks sturdy. It is, Dahlia agreed as the sheriff pushed through the gate and approached the porch. Finally got around to fixing it. Mighty fine craftsmanship, Miller observed, running a hand over the smooth wood. Didn't know you had such carpentry skills, Mrs. Harrison. Before Dahlia could respond, the cabin door opened, and Knox stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Coffee's on, he said pleasantly before turning his attention to the visitors. Evening, gentlemen. Sheriff Miller's hand instinctively moved closer to his holstered revolver, his eyes narrowing as he took in Knox's appearance. Don't believe we've met, he said carefully. James Knox, Knox said, extending his hand with casual confidence. Old friend of Edward Harrison's from his Colorado mining days. Miller didn't take the offered hand. That's so? Funny, I knew Ed Harrison pretty well. Don't recall him ever mentioning a James Knox. Dad had many friends from his mining days, Dahlia interjected smoothly. He didn't always bring them up in conversation, especially after he settled here and focused on ranching. The sheriff's gaze shifted between Knox and Dahlia, suspicion evident in his expression. And what brings you to Willow Creek, Mr. Knox? We don't get many visitors this time of year. Dahlia wrote to me about struggling with the spring planting, Knox replied without hesitation. I was between jobs and thought I'd come help an old friend's daughter. Ed would have done the same for my family. Young Dan Hansen, who had finally dismounted and joined them by the porch, spoke up eagerly. "Sheriff, that's the man I told you about, the one I saw working on the fence yesterday." "Thank you, Dan," the sheriff said dryly. "I figured that out myself." He turned his attention back to Knox. "You arrived when exactly?" "About a week ago," Knox said, his expression open and untroubled despite the interrogation. "Planned to stay through the spring planting, maybe help with some repairs around the place. As you can see, the ranch could use an extra pair of hands." Miller nodded slowly. "Interesting timing, your arrival." "Just about when those bounty hunters came through looking for a fugitive fitting your general description." "Is that so?" Knox said, sounding mildly interested. "What's this fugitive supposed to have done?" "Murdered his employer in Denver," Miller said bluntly, watching Knox's face closely for any reaction. "Shot him in the back and robbed his safe." Knox shook his head. "Sounds like a desperate man. Hope you catch him." The sheriff wasn't deterred. "Mind if I ask where you were 2 weeks ago, Mr. Knox?" "Carson City," Knox replied without hesitation. "Working as a wrangler for the Carson Valley Ranch. You're welcome to wire them if you'd like to confirm." Dahlia kept her expression neutral, though inside she was impressed by Knox's quick thinking. It was a clever alibi far enough away to be plausible, but close enough that his presence in Wyoming wouldn't seem suspicious. Sheriff Miller seemed less impressed. "Maybe I will," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced it would be worth the effort. "In the meantime, I'd appreciate if you'd both keep an eye out for anything suspicious. This fugitive, Blackwood, is considered dangerous." "We'll be vigilant," Dahlia assured him. "Though I doubt any fugitives would choose such an isolated spot to hide. We're hardly on the main routes to anywhere." "Criminals don't always think logically," Miller replied. "But I appreciate your cooperation." He settled his hat back on his head and turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, Mrs. Harrison, there's a social at the church this Sunday. Might be nice for you to attend, introduce your friend to the community." The invitation was clearly a test, and both Dahlia and Knox knew it. "That's very thoughtful, Sheriff," Dahlia said carefully. "We'll certainly consider it." After the sheriff and young Hanson had ridden away, Dahlia and Knox remained on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did Dahlia release the breath she'd been holding. "He doesn't believe us," she said quietly. Knox nodded grimly. "No, he doesn't. But he doesn't have enough to act on his suspicions yet. That invitation to the social was clever. He's hoping to trip us up in public, see if our story holds up under the scrutiny of the entire town." "What do we do?" Dahlia asked, suddenly weary from the tension of the encounter. Knox turned to her, his expression resolute. "We go to the social. We stick to our story, answer questions consistently, and give them no reason to doubt us. And if someone recognizes you? If there's a wanted poster with your face on it? Then we deal with that if it happens," Knox said, though his jaw tightened at the possibility. "In the meantime, I think we should practice our story, make sure we have the details straight about how I knew your father, when we last saw each other, that sort of thing." Dahlia nodded, though the prospect of facing the entire town with their fabricated tale filled her with dread. She'd avoided social gatherings since Patrick's death, preferring solitude to the pitying glances and whispered comments that inevitably followed her. Now she would have to endure their scrutiny once again, with even higher stakes. "Come inside," she said finally. "That coffee should be ready by now, and we have a lot to discuss." They spent the evening crafting a detailed history of James Knox's friendship with Edward Harrison, creating a plausible timeline that would stand up to the town's inevitable questions. Knox proved to have a sharp memory and a gift for creating convincing details, weaving their fabrication into a narrative that almost convinced even Dahlia by the end of the night. "You're quite good at this," she observed as they finished their second pot of coffee. "Creating stories out of thin air." Knox smiled wryly. "A useful skill for a man who's spent most of his life moving from place to place. People like to know who you are, where you came from. Sometimes the truth doesn't suit the situation. And what is the truth about you, Knox Blackwood? Dahlia asked softly. Beyond the wanted posters and bounty hunters, who are you really? Knox's smile faded, his eyes growing distant. A man who's never stayed in one place long enough to find out, I suppose. He met her gaze, his expression more vulnerable than she'd seen before. Until now. The implication in his words hung between them, too fragile to acknowledge directly. Dahlia busied herself with gathering their empty cups, unsure how to respond to the sudden intimacy of the moment. It's late, she said finally. We should both get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day if we're to prepare for Sunday's social. Knox nodded, rising from his chair. You're right. Thank you for the coffee and for everything else. As he turned to leave, Dahlia found herself speaking without having planned to. Knox. He paused, looking back at her. I'm glad you're here. Despite everything, the danger, the deception, I'm glad it was my broken gate you came through that day. The smile that spread across his face then was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, warm, luminous, full of promise. So am I, Dahlia. So am I. The days leading up to the church social were filled with nervous preparation. Dahlia aired out her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been her mother's, altered to fit her smaller frame. Knox mended his shirt and polished his boots, and together they rehearsed their story until they could recite details of their fabricated history without hesitation. On Sunday morning, Dahlia stood before her small mirror, pinning her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical braid. Her fingers trembled slightly with the unfamiliar task. It had been years since she'd bothered with such feminine rituals. A knock at the cabin door startled her, and she quickly secured the last pin before going to answer it. Knox stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking startlingly handsome in his freshly laundered shirt and neatly combed hair. He trimmed his beard as well, revealing more of the strong line of his jaw. He seemed equally struck by her appearance, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her dress and carefully arranged hair. You look beautiful, he said simply. Dahlia felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you. You clean up quite well yourself. They rode to town in Dahlia's wagon, the spring sunshine warm on their faces. As they approached Willow Creek, Knox reached over to squeeze her hand briefly. Remember, he said quietly, we have nothing to hide. We're just old friends enjoying a social gathering. Dahlia nodded, though her heart was racing. Old friends, she repeated, trying to ignore how untrue those words felt, how inadequate they were to describe what had grown between them in the past 2 weeks. The church was already crowded when they arrived, tables set up in the yard laden with food brought by the townspeople. Conversations paused as Dahlia and Knox made their entrance, curious eyes following their progress across the yard. Mrs. Peterson was the first to approach them, her round face alight with curiosity barely disguised as welcome. Dahlia, how lovely to see you! It's been ages since you've joined us for a social. Her gaze moved to Knox, frankly assessing. And this must be your guest we've heard about. James Knox, Knox said, offering his hand with an easy smile. Pleasure to meet you, madam. James is an old friend of my father's, Dahlia explained, the practiced words coming more naturally than she'd expected. He's helping me with the spring planting and some repairs around the ranch. Mrs. Peterson's eyes sparkled with undisguised interest. How wonderful! Edward always spoke so highly of his mining friends. You must tell us how you two met. And so it began, the gentle interrogation disguised as friendly conversation, as one by one, the townspeople came to meet the stranger in their midst. Knox handled each interaction with charm and confidence, never faltering in their rehearsed story, while Dahlia stood beside him, adding details when appropriate and trying to appear more relaxed than she felt. Sheriff Miller watched from a distance, his expression unreadable as he observed their progress through the crowd. Dahlia caught his eye once and nodded politely, determined not to show any sign of the anxiety his scrutiny provoked. You're doing wonderfully, Knox murmured as they finally found a moment alone by the refreshment table. They're eating up every word. Not all of them, Dahlia replied quietly, nodding toward the sheriff. He's still watching us like a hawk. Let him watch, Knox said with more confidence than she suspected he felt. Our story is solid. Before Dahlia could respond, Reverend Thomas approached, his kind face creased in a welcoming smile. Mrs. Harrison, so good to see you among us again. And Mr. Knox, I understand you're quite the carpenter. That new gate of Dahlia's is the talk of the town. Knox chuckled modestly. Just a simple repair, Reverend. The ranch needed some attention, and I was happy to provide it. Well, we're all grateful to see Dahlia getting some help out there, the Reverend said, his tone genuine. Many of us have worried about her, taking on so much alone. I've managed just fine, Dahlia said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice despite her best efforts. Of course you have, Reverend Thomas agreed quickly. But even the strongest among us need a helping hand sometimes. He turned to Knox. Will you be staying in Willow Creek long, Mr. Knox? Knox glanced at Dahlia before answering. That depends on a few things, Reverend. I hadn't planned on a lengthy stay, but... He let the sentence trail off, his eyes still on Dahlia. The Reverend's smile widened knowingly. I see. Well, you'd be a welcome addition to our community, should you decide to put down roots. As the afternoon progressed, Dahlia found herself gradually relaxing, even enjoying some aspects of the social. It had been so long since she'd engaged in simple pleasures like community singing and shared meals that she'd forgotten how comforting such rituals could be. Knox stayed close to her side throughout, his presence both protective and attentive. When the fiddler struck up a tune and couples began to dance in the cleared area of the churchyard, he turned to her with a question in his eyes. Would it seem strange if we didn't dance? He asked quietly. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. Dahlia hesitated. Dancing together would certainly reinforce their story of being comfortable old acquaintances, but it would also mean physical closeness that might be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with bounty hunters or suspicious sheriffs. One dance, she decided, offering her hand. For appearance's sake. Knox led her to the edge of the dancing area, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while taking her hand with the other. The fiddle music swelled around them, a lively reel that had most couples laughing as they spun and turned. At first, Dahlia felt stiff and self-conscious, acutely aware of the eyes watching them. But as Knox guided her confidently through the steps, his hand warm and steady at her waist, she gradually surrendered to the music and the moment. You're a good dancer, she observed, surprised by his grace. Knox smiled down at her. Don't sound so shocked. I may be a saddle tramp, but I've attended my share of barn dances. I didn't mean, Dahlia began, embarrassed. I know, Knox assured her, his eyes crinkling with genuine amusement. I'm teasing you, Dahlia. You should smile more often, it suits you. The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. As they turned through the figures of the dance, Dahlia found herself relaxing into his arms, allowing herself to enjoy the novel sensation of being held, of moving in harmony with another person. When the music ended, Knox held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Around them, other couples were breaking apart, applauding the musicians, but for a suspended moment, they remained connected, something unspoken passing between them. The spell was broken by Sheriff Miller's deliberate approach. Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Knox, he greeted, his tone professionally pleasant. Enjoying the festivities? Very much, Sheriff, Knox replied, finally releasing Dahlia's hand. Willow Creek knows how to welcome a visitor. Indeed we do, Miller agreed, his eyes sharp despite his cordial tone. Though we're also cautious about strangers, especially these days. Had another wire from Denver this morning, as a matter of fact. Dahlia felt Knox tense beside her, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. Oh? More news about that fugitive you mentioned? The sheriff nodded slowly. Seems this Blackwood character may have been seen heading north through Cheyenne last week. Descriptions fairly general, though dark hair, blue eyes around 6 feet tall. His gaze moved pointedly over Knox. Fits a fair number of men in these parts, including half the men at this social, Dahlia observed, struggling to keep her voice steady. Hardly seems a useful description. True enough, Miller conceded. But they're sending a more detailed poster with a sketch soon. Should make identification easier. He tipped his hat. Enjoy the rest of the social, folks. Don't be strangers in town. As the sheriff walked away, Dahlia released the breath she'd been holding. A sketch, she whispered, alarm coursing through her. Knox, if they have a drawing of you, let's not worry about that until we see it, Knox said, though the tension in his jaw belied his calm words. For now, we continue as planned. We've made a good impression today, let's not waste it by appearing nervous or leaving abruptly. Dahlia nodded, forcing a smile as Mrs. Peterson approached with a plate of pie. But inwardly, her mind was racing. A detailed wanted poster would make it impossible for Knox to remain hidden in Willow Creek. Their carefully constructed story would crumble, and both of them would face consequences, Knox for the murder he insisted he didn't commit, and Dahlia for harboring him. They remained at the social for another hour, maintaining their charade of casual friendship, while both were acutely aware of the ticking clock. When they finally took their leave, several townspeople called out warm farewells, clearly won over by Knox's charm and the apparent legitimacy of their story. The ride back to the ranch was silent, both lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie grass that waved gently in the spring breeze. How long do you think we have? Dahlia finally asked as the ranch came into view, the new gate standing proudly at the entrance. Knox sighed heavily. A few days at most. Once that poster arrives, Miller will know. He's already suspicious, he just needs confirmation. Then what? Dahlia pressed, turning to look at him. You'll run? I don't want to, Knox admitted, his voice low and rough with emotion. God help me, Dahlia, the last thing I want to do is leave this place. Leave you? His words hung in the air between them, too honest to ignore. Dahlia's heart pounded in her chest as the wagon rolled through the gate, and came to a stop before the cabin. Then don't, she said simply, meeting his gaze. We'll find another way. Knox helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. They stood close, the evening air cool around them but warmth building between them. What other way is there? Knox asked softly. I won't see you charged as an accomplice. We still have time, Dahlia insisted. Your friend in Denver might find something to clear your name. And until then. She hesitated, then continued with newfound resolve. Until then, we have today. And tonight. Understanding dawned in Knox's eyes, followed by a question, a caution. Dahlia, are you sure? If you're offering what I think you are. In answer, Dahlia reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. I've been alone for so long, Knox. We both have. Whatever time we have, whether it's days or years, I don't want to waste it being cautious. Knox's restraint broke. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers with a hunger that matched her own. Dahlia melted against him, her arms winding around his neck as the kiss deepened, expressing all the longing and fear and hope that words couldn't contain. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Knox rested his forehead against hers. I never expected to find you, he murmured. Standing by that broken gate, looking like something out of a dream I didn't know I had. Dahlia smiled, her heart fuller than it had been in years. I never expected you either. But here we are. Hand in hand, they walked into the cabin, closing the door on the world outside and the uncertain future that awaited them. For tonight, at least, they would claim this happiness, this connection that had grown between them against all odds. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, they came together again, their kisses growing more urgent, hands exploring with tender curiosity. Knox was patient and gentle, treating her with a reverence that brought tears to Dahlia's eyes. When they finally lay together in her narrow bed, their bodies joining in the ancient rhythm of desire and comfort, Dahlia felt something inside her healing a wound she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, they spoke in hushed voices of things they'd never shared with anyone else: childhood memories, secret fears, quiet hopes. Knox told her about growing up with a father who drifted from mining camp to ranch, never settling anywhere for long. Dahlia shared stories of her mother, who died when she was 12, leaving her with only fading memories and a blue dress that still smelled faintly of lavender. "If things were different," Knox said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "If I wasn't a wanted man, what would you want from life, Dahlia?" She considered the question seriously. "This ranch, made whole again. Perhaps a few more cattle, an orchard like my father planned." She turned to look at him, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "Someone to share it with. Children, someday." Knox pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That sounds like paradise. What about you?" Dahlia asked. "What would you want if you could choose freely?" "Roots," Knox said without hesitation. "A place that's mine, that I've built with my own hands. A woman who looks at me the way you do." His voice roughened. "A family." The word hung between them, full of longing and possibility. Dahlia pressed closer to him, as if by physical proximity she could hold on to this dream that seemed increasingly fragile in the face of reality. "We'll find a way," she whispered, as much to convince herself as him. "Whatever it takes, we'll find a way to make this real." Knox didn't respond except to hold her tighter, and in his silence, Dahlia heard the doubt he wouldn't voice. But she chose to believe in him, in them, in the possibility of a future that only days ago would have seemed impossible. Eventually, they drifted to sleep, tangled together in the narrow bed, while outside, the Wyoming night wrapped around the small cabin like a protective cloak, stars spinning silently overhead in their ancient patterns. Morning came too soon, golden light filtering through the curtains to find them still entwined. Dahlia woke first, watching Knox as he slept, his face relaxed and younger looking without the weight of vigilance he carried when awake. She traced his features lightly with her fingertips, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crease between his brows, the curve of his lips that had kissed her so thoroughly the night before. As if sensing her scrutiny, Knox's eyes opened, focusing immediately on her face. A slow smile spread across his features, warming his blue eyes. "Good morning," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Dahlia replied, suddenly shy despite their intimacy. Knox pulled her closer, kissing her with morning-soft tenderness. "No regrets?" he asked when they parted. "None," she assured him, resting her head against his chest. "Though I do worry what happens next." Knox sighed, his hand moving in soothing circles on her back. "Today, we continue as we have been. I'll work on the repairs I've started, you'll tend to your usual chores. We'll wait for word from my friend in Denver, and we'll hope the sheriff remains patient." It was a tenuous plan at best, but Dahlia nodded against his chest. "And tonight?" She felt his smile against her hair. "Tonight I'll come back to you, if you'll have me." "I will," she whispered, lifting her face for another kiss. They rose reluctantly, returning to the patterns of their separate days, Knox to the barn to continue repairs on the roof, Dahlia to her kitchen to prepare breakfast and plan the day's chores. But everything had shifted, colored now by what they'd shared and the promises whispered in the dark. The day passed in a strange mixture of ordinary tasks and extraordinary awareness. Every glance they exchanged across the yard held new meaning. Every casual touch as they passed tools or shared the noon meal sparked warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. By mid-afternoon, Dahlia was in the vegetable garden, weeding the newly planted rows, when she heard the now familiar sound of approaching horses. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun to see two riders approaching from the direction of town. Her heart sank as she recognized Sheriff Miller's broad silhouette. The second rider was his deputy, a young man named Collins who'd only been in Willow Creek for a few months. Knox emerged from the barn, alerted by the same sounds. His eyes met Dahlia's across the yard, a silent question passing between them. She shook her head slightly. Too late to run, too late to hide. They would have to face whatever came next together. As the riders approached the gate, Dahlia removed her gardening gloves and smoothed her hair, trying to appear calm and collected. Knox moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring despite the tension evident in his posture. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Dahlia called as Miller dismounted. "Twice in 1 week, to what do we owe the honor?" Miller's expression was grim as he pushed through the gate, Deputy Collins following close behind. "Afraid this isn't a social call, Mrs. Harrison." His hand rested meaningfully on the revolver at his hip. "Got that poster from Denver this morning." Dahlia felt Knox stiffen beside her but kept her voice steady. "Oh? Did they catch that fugitive you mentioned?" "Not yet." Miller reached into his vest and withdrew a folded paper. "But we know exactly who we're looking for now." He unfolded the paper, revealing a remarkably accurate sketch of Knox's face, with the name, Knox Blackwood, printed boldly across the top and "Wanted for murder" beneath it. "Strange coincidence," Miller continued, his eyes fixed on Knox. "Fellow looks an awful lot like you, Mr. Knox. Even shares your last name, or part of it at least." Knox remained silent, his expression carefully neutral despite the damning evidence before them. "Sheriff," Dahlia began, but Miller cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Save it, Mrs. Harrison. I gave you both plenty of chances to come clean." He turned to his deputy. "Collins, arrest Mr. Blackwood for the murder of Joseph Whitaker and the theft of $5,000. As Collins moved forward, drawing handcuffs from his belt, Knox slowly raised his hands to show he wasn't reaching for his weapon. "I didn't kill Whitaker," he said calmly. "And I didn't take his money." "Tell it to the judge in Denver," Miller replied unsympathetically. "You'll be on the next train south as soon as we get you back to town." "And Mrs. Harrison?" Knox asked, his concern evident despite his composed demeanor. Miller's expression softened slightly as he looked at Dahlia. "That depends on her. Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense, but given her standing in the community and the possibility she was misled, I might be persuaded to overlook her involvement." "She didn't know," Knox said firmly. "I told her the same story I told you, that I was a friend of her father's. She's innocent in this." Dahlia stepped forward, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. "That's not true. I knew exactly who he was, Sheriff. I chose to help him because I believe he's innocent." "Dahlia, don't," Knox warned, but she shook her head. "I won't let you take the blame alone, Knox. Not when I know you didn't commit this crime." Miller sighed heavily. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand you may have developed feelings for this man, but that doesn't change the facts. He's wanted for murder, and you've been harboring him." "The facts are what I'm counting on, Sheriff," Dahlia replied. "Knox didn't kill Joseph Whitaker. He was framed, and we believe we know by whom." This caught Miller's attention. "That's so? And what evidence do you have to support this claim?" "We've written to a friend in Denver who's looking into it," Knox explained. "We believe Whitaker's foreman, Daniel Prescott, may have been the real killer. He had access to the office, knew about the money in the safe, and conveniently became ranch manager after Whitaker's death." Miller considered this, his expression skeptical but not entirely dismissive. "That's a convenient theory, but without proof, then give us time to get proof," Dahlia pleaded. "Hold Knox here, under house arrest if you must, but don't send him back to Denver yet. If he's innocent, sending him back could mean his death before the truth comes out." The sheriff looked between them, clearly weighing his options. "You're asking me to ignore a direct order from Denver authorities based on nothing but your word and a suspicion about another man. I'm asking you to give justice a chance to work properly," Dahlia countered. "Isn't that what your badge represents, Sheriff?" "Justice, not just blind enforcement." Miller removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair in frustration. "Damnation, woman, you don't make this easy." He turned to his deputy. "Collins, cuff Mr. Blackwood. We'll take him back to town and hold him in our jail while we wire Denver for more information about this Prescott fellow." As Collins approached with the handcuffs, Knox held Dahlia's gaze, his eyes conveying everything he couldn't say aloud: his love, his fear for her, his gratitude. Dahlia fought back tears as the cold metal closed around his wrists. "What about Mrs. Harrison?" Collins asked. Miller hesitated, then sighed again. "For now, she stays here. But," he added, fixing Dahlia with a stern look, "you're not to leave this property without my permission, understood? Consider yourself under house arrest until this matter is resolved." Dahlia nodded, relief washing through her at not being separated from the ranch. "Thank you, Sheriff." "And Knox, what will happen to him?" "He'll be comfortable enough in our jail," Miller assured her. "It's not the Ritz Hotel, but it's clean, and Mrs. Miller sends over decent meals for the prisoners." Knox managed a small smile for Dahlia's benefit. "I'll be fine. Keep faith, Dahlia." As they led Knox to the horses, Dahlia felt a desperate need to say more, to tell him everything in her heart in case this was their last moment together. But with the sheriff and deputy watching, she could only nod and say, "I'll wait for word from your friend. We'll get through this, Knox." The look he gave her over his shoulder, as they led him away, held such depth of feeling that Dahlia's breath caught in her throat. Then he was mounted on the deputy's horse, hands cuffed before him, riding away from the ranch that had briefly been their shared haven. Dahlia stood by the gate, the new gate Knox had built with such care, and watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Only then did she allow the tears to fall, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief and fear. But as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Dahlia wiped her eyes and straightened her spine. Crying wouldn't help Knox. Action would. And despite the sheriff's orders, she had no intention of sitting idly by while Knox's fate hung in the balance. The following days passed in a fog of anxiety and determined action for Dahlia. Though confined to her property, she wrote letters to the livery stable in Denver where Knox's friend worked, to the territorial governor pleading Knox's case, and to Whitaker's widow herself, appealing to her sense of justice. Each morning, she rode to the edge of her property to give the letters to young Billy Peterson, who had agreed to post them in town for a small fee. It was technically a violation of her house arrest, but Dahlia considered it a necessary risk. 5 days after Knox's arrest, Billy returned not just to collect her latest letter but to deliver news. "Sheriff got a wire from Denver yesterday," the boy reported eagerly, accepting the penny Dahlia offered him. "Ma says it caused quite a stir. Something about that fellow they're holding in the jail." Dahlia's heart quickened. "What did it say, Billy? Do you know?" The boy puffed up with importance. "Sheriff wouldn't say exactly, but he sent Deputy Collins riding out toward Cheyenne like his tail was on fire. Ma thinks they might be bringing someone back, a witness or something." "Thank you, Billy," Dahlia said, pressing an extra penny into his palm. "You're a good friend." After the boy left, Dahlia paced her small cabin, hope and fear warring within her. A witness could mean evidence supporting Knox's innocence or further proof of his supposed guilt. Without knowing the contents of the wire, she could only wait and pray. 2 more days passed with no news. Dahlia tended her garden mechanically, fed her livestock, and tried to maintain the repairs Knox had started, though her carpentry skills were limited. Each night, she lay awake in the bed they had shared, wondering if he was comfortable, if he was safe, if he still had hope. On the morning of the 8th day since Knox's arrest, Dahlia was collecting eggs from the chicken coop when she heard horses approaching. She hurried to the front of the cabin, her heart in her throat, to see Sheriff Miller riding toward the gate, accompanied by Deputy Collins and a third man she didn't recognize. She set down her basket of eggs and waited by the porch steps, trying to read the sheriff's expression as he dismounted. To her surprise, he was smiling. "Mrs. Harrison," he called as he approached. "Got someone here I think you'll want to meet." The third rider dismounted, revealing a slight man with spectacles and a nervous demeanor. He removed his hat, revealing thinning brown hair, and nodded politely to Dahlia. "Madam, my name's Herbert Simmons. I was Mr. Whitaker's bookkeeper in Denver." Dahlia's confusion must have shown on her face, because Sheriff Miller quickly explained. Mr. Simmons here has some information about the Whitaker murder that changes things considerably. He gestured for the bookkeeper to continue. Simmons cleared his throat. I've been in hiding since Mr. Whitaker's death, madam. I was afraid, you see. I knew something wasn't right about his murder, but I didn't have proof until recently. What proof? Dahlia asked, hope beginning to kindle within her. Account ledgers? Simmons explained, gaining confidence as he spoke. Mr. Whitaker suspected his foreman, Prescott, was embezzling from the ranch accounts. He asked me to review the books privately and report any discrepancies. The day before he was killed, I told him I'd found evidence of substantial theft, over $3,000 missing over 6 months, all traceable to Prescott. And you think Prescott killed Whitaker to cover this up? Dahlia pressed. Simmons nodded vigorously. Mr. Whitaker told me he planned to confront Prescott the next day, the day he was killed. After the murder, I was too frightened to come forward. But when I heard they'd arrested Mr. Blackwood, who I knew to be an honest man, I couldn't stay silent. I took the ledgers and left Denver, intending to bring them to the territorial authorities. Mr. Simmons got as far as Cheyenne before falling ill. Sheriff Miller continued. He told his story to the local sheriff there, who wired us immediately. Collins rode out to bring him back, along with the ledgers. And Knox? Dahlia asked, hardly daring to hope. What does this mean for him? The sheriff's smile widened. It means he's a free man, Mrs. Harrison. Denver authorities have already arrested Prescott, who broke down and confessed when confronted with the evidence. The charges against Blackwood have been dropped. Dahlia's knees weakened with relief. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself. Where is he? Is he still in your jail? No, madam. Deputy Collins spoke up. He insisted on taking care of some business in town before coming out here. Said he'd be along shortly. As if summoned by the deputy's words, another rider appeared on the horizon, moving at a gallop toward the ranch. Even at a distance, Dahlia recognized Knox's strong silhouette and the chestnut horse he rode. Well, Sheriff Miller said, a knowing twinkle in his eye. Seems our business here is concluded. Mr. Simmons will be staying in town tonight before continuing to Denver to give his formal statement. He replaced his hat, tipping it slightly to Dahlia. Mrs. Harrison, I believe I owe you an apology for doubting your judgment about Mr. Blackwood. Accepted, Sheriff, Dahlia replied, her eyes still fixed on the approaching rider. And thank you for being willing to consider the evidence rather than simply shipping him back to Denver. The men mounted their horses and departed, crossing paths with Knox at the gate. Words were exchanged that Dahlia couldn't hear, along with handshakes that suggested a newfound respect between Knox and the lawman. Then Knox was through the gate, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped, striding toward her with purpose in every step. Dahlia ran to meet him, propriety forgotten as she threw herself into his arms. Knox caught her, lifting her off her feet in a fierce embrace. Dahlia, he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. My God, I've missed you. When he set her down, Dahlia saw that his eyes were suspiciously bright. Is it true? She asked. You're really free? All charges dropped? Knox nodded, his hands cupping her face gently. Completely exonerated. Prescott confessed to everything, the embezzlement, the murder, even planting evidence to frame me. I'm a free man. Joy bubbled up within Dahlia, spilling over in laughter and tears. I never lost faith, she told him. Not for a moment. I know, Knox said softly. Your belief in me kept me going these past days. His expression grew serious. Dahlia, there's something I need to ask you. Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. I had business in town this morning before coming here. Important business. He opened the pouch, tipping a simple gold band onto his palm. This isn't much, not the kind of ring a woman like you deserves. But it's a promise if you'll have it. A promise that I'll spend the rest of my life making you happy, Building this ranch with you, creating the family we both want. Dahlia's breath caught as Knox dropped to one knee before her, holding the ring up like an offering. Dahlia Harrison, I love you. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you standing by that broken gate, proud and fierce and so beautiful it hurt to look at you. Will you marry me? Tears blurred Dahlia's vision as she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Knox slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms again, his kiss conveying all the love and promise and relief that words couldn't express. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Dahlia touched the ring on her finger wonderingly. I never thought I'd have this again, a chance at happiness, at family. Neither did I, Knox admitted, his arms secure around her waist as they walked toward the cabin. I'd resigned myself to a solitary life, always moving, never belonging anywhere. Then I found you, and suddenly I could see a future I never dared imagine. Inside the cabin that had once felt too empty, too full of echoes and memories, they sat at the kitchen table, hands linked, making plans for their shared future. Knox spoke of expanding the cattle herd, of the orchard they would plant on the south slope, of adding rooms to the cabin for the children they hoped to have. Dahlia listened, adding her own ideas, her heart expanding with each shared dream. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a certainty, a rightness that felt like coming home after a long journey. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting golden light across the simple room, Knox paused in his enthusiastic planning to look at her with wonder in his eyes. I still can't believe this is real, he said softly. That we found each other in the vastness of this territory, against such impossible odds. Dahlia squeezed his hand, the gold band on her finger catching the light. Perhaps not so impossible, she mused. Perhaps we were always meant to find each other. You needed a safe haven, and I needed someone brave enough to walk through a broken gate and claim me. Knox brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. The best decision I ever made, he murmured. Walking through that gate to you. Epilogue 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the flourishing ranch, warming the fresh paint on the expanded cabin and glinting off the new weather vane atop the sturdy barn. In the south field, rows of young apple trees stood in neat lines, their branches beginning to bend with the weight of their first real harvest. Dahlia stood on the porch, shading her eyes as she watched her husband and son return from checking the north pasture fence. Knox sat tall in the saddle, 3-year-old Edward perched securely before him, the boys' laughter carrying across the yard as they approached. Mama! Edward called, waving excitedly. Papa let me help fix the fence. I held the nails. Did you now? Dahlia replied, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. What a big help you must have been. Knox dismounted smoothly, lifting Edward down before securing his horse to the hitching post, a new addition that matched the sturdy gate that now marked the entrance to the Harrison Blackwood ranch. He's a natural rancher, Knox said proudly, ruffling the boy's dark hair. Got your eye for detail and my charm. Heaven help us all, Dahlia laughed, adjusting the small bundle in her arms as 2-month-old Sarah stirred from her nap. Knox climbed the porch steps, pausing to kiss Dahlia before peering at his daughter's tiny face. And how's our little lady today? Perfect, Dahlia replied, leaning into his side as they gazed down at their children, Edward now busy demonstrating his fence-fixing technique to an imaginary audience, Sarah blinking up at her parents with eyes that matched her father's clear blue. 5 years had transformed both the ranch and their lives. The once struggling homestead now boasted a healthy herd of cattle, productive fields, and the beginnings of the orchard Edward Harrison had once dreamed of. The cabin had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, with a proper bedroom for the children and a larger kitchen where Dahlia taught young Edward to bake the biscuits his father loved. But the most profound changes were the ones visible only to those who had known them before, the contentment in Dahlia's eyes that had replaced the wary loneliness, the settled purpose in Knox's bearing that spoke of a man who had found his place in the world. Reverend Thomas asked if we'll be at the church social next Sunday, Dahlia mentioned as they watched Edward chase a butterfly across the yard. He's hoping you'll help judge the pie contest again. Knox grinned. How could I refuse such an important civic duty? Especially when Mrs. Peterson promised a rematch after I chose Jenny Wilson's apple pie over hers last year. A brave man indeed. Dahlia teased, her eyes warm with affection, facing down ornery cattle and angry pie bakers without flinching. Knox's arm tightened around her waist. Only the truly important things frighten me anymore, he admitted, his voice softening as he gazed at his family. The thought of losing any of you, of somehow failing as a husband or father, those are the only fears that keep me awake at night now. Dahlia turned in his embrace to face him fully. You could never fail us, Knox. You've given us everything I ever dreamed of and more. He touched the silver strands that had begun to appear in her chestnut hair, his expression tender. As have you, my love. Every day, I think whatever twist of fate led me to your broken gate that evening. It's not broken anymore, Dahlia pointed out, nodding toward the sturdy entrance that now stood as a symbol of all they had built together. No, Knox agreed, his gaze taking in their flourishing ranch, their beautiful children, and finally returning to rest on his wife's beloved face. Nothing about our life is broken anymore. Together, we've mended everything that matters. As the summer day began to soften toward evening, the family gathered on the porch, Knox and Dahlia side by side in the rocking chairs he had crafted during her pregnancy with Sarah, Edward playing with wooden horses at their feet, the baby sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. From this vantage point, they could see the full expanse of their ranch, the cattle grazing contentedly in the distance, the golden fields ripening under the Wyoming sun. It was everything they had dreamed of that night 5 years ago, when they had first dared to imagine a future together. But the reality was richer, deeper, more satisfying than even their most hopeful visions. As twilight descended and the first stars appeared overhead, Knox reached for Dahlia's hand, their fingers intertwining with the familiar comfort of two people who had found in each other not just love but home. Happy? He asked simply, though he already knew the answer from the peace in her eyes. Dahlia nodded, squeezing his hand as she gazed out at the kingdom they had built together from a broken gate and wounded hearts. Completely, she answered. Absolutely. Forever.